Okay, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about how the United States chose to end the war in the Pacific. We've already talked a little bit about how we ended the war in Europe and the invasion of Berlin, but the war actually doesn't end there. The war ends later in the Pacific, a few months later, when the United States chooses to drop the first atomic bomb on the country of Japan. What are the factors that lead up to this decision? There's several that are significant. One of the most significant is simply the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on April the 12th, 1945. Roosevelt dies he suffers a stroke in the arms of his mistress, apparently, and that puts a different person in charge. That person is Harry Truman, Roosevelt's vice president. There's a lot of speculation that had Roosevelt remained alive, he would not have chosen to drop the atomic bomb. Of course, that's speculation. But nonetheless, it is the death of Roosevelt who places Truman in the position to make that decision. And by all accounts, Truman, when he took over, had no idea what was going on. He had to be brought up to speed on this. Uh, but nonetheless, he makes the tough decision. And Truman was somewhat known for that throughout most of his presidency, making difficult decisions. And he certainly does in this case. The other factor that really, well, one of the other factors that really pushes us to make the decision to drop the atomic bomb was the invasion of Japan. The invasion was predicted to be extremely costly. 1 million casualties just on the side of the Americans. That's how many people would be killed or injured if we had to go ahead and invade Japan. And quite frankly, we weren't really sure that our troops would do this. The only force we had big enough to launch such an invasion was the Army, and they just finished up their bit over in Europe. And there were a lot of folks in the Army who weren't too thrilled. They had spent the better part of the last several years expecting not to see the end of every day, and now the war in Europe was over, and they thought, oh, we made it. We're going to get to go home. We're going to see our kids. We're going to see our wives. We're going to see our parents, our brothers, our sisters. And the prospect of having to turn around and go invade Japan, where 1 million people were expected to die or get hurt, was something that was a difficult thing. And there was some speculation that would they do it. Um, and the reason for that prediction was really simply our experiences on two prior invasions of islands as we got closer to Japan, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the Japanese fought just ferociously to defend those two islands that weren't even the Japanese homeland. They fought almost to the last person, and we were scared. What if we invaded Japan and they fought that way again? How many Japanese would we have to kill in order to subdue Japan? And so the predicted casualties really played a significant was really a significant factor in our decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and then again on Nagasaki. We were also wanting to invade Japan and put an end to the war because Russia was getting into it, and we could already see in Europe that Russia was going to split up Eastern Europe. Wherever Russia was, they made that into a communist state, and so they were already working their way down the Korean Peninsula. So we wanted to put an end to the war as quickly as possible to prevent Japan from being taken over, or at least partially taken by the communists and by the Soviet Union. So lots of reasons why we made our decision to drop the atomic bomb, but how did we actually develop it? It was a secret project, codenamed the Manhattan Project. And the very first stages of it actually take place in Chicago, where we have the very first ever atomic reaction. It takes place underneath the football field at the University of Chicago, Stagg Field. Not literally under the turf, but back in the day, the bleachers were built on basically the roofs of buildings, and so it wasn't uncommon to find dormitories, especially athletes' dormitories, being part of the football stadium. And underneath in the basement is where they house the physics department at the University of Chicago. And there was a lot of controversy surrounding this. A lot of people were afraid that if you started to split atoms apart, there'd be a chain reaction. You could conceivably destroy the entire atmosphere of the planet. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but it was not without controversy. So the first reaction takes place in Chicago, and from there we go ahead and quickly develop our resources. One of the primary places we do that is Oak Ridge, Tennessee. There's two plants that are developed there and part of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And they basically go ahead and operate to go ahead and enrich the uranium that would be necessary to fuel the atomic bomb. When that plant was turned on at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, it used approximately 1/10 of all of the electricity in the United States. That's how much electricity it took to run that particular plant to enrich that uranium. So it was an absolutely massive effort. There was another effort to enrich plutonium out in Hanford, Washington, that was run by the DuPont company. The products are shipped off then to a group working in Los Alamos, New Mexico. a group headed up by a German physicist by the name of Robert Oppenheimer. He is in charge of the team that detonates the first nuclear device. And the first nuclear device, it wasn't really a bomb at this point, it was really an experiment. It was held together literally with duct tape. Is exploded in the desert of New Mexico at a place called Alamogordo. It takes place on July 16th, 1945, when Robert Oppenheimer witnesses the very first ever atomic explosion. The quote that runs through his mind is a quote from an ancient Hindu text called the Bhagavad Gita, and the quote goes, roughly translated, it's something like this: "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." That's what he thinks of. He realizes the absolute devastation that this weapon is capable of, and it's difficult, without a doubt. And if you notice, the date there was early July, and this was the first atomic device. We will drop the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945. So basically a month later. Again, this was a brand new technology. The first bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima was very much itself an experiment. It was dropped by a plane called the Enola Gay, flown by Captain Paul Tibbets, and everything about it was just new. I mean, the Enola Gay was a hand-picked crew, the best that we had, and even so, they had to drop the bomb from such a high altitude that they actually had to design new mechanisms by which to drop the bomb. They found that they were dropping the bomb from so high up that the traditional bombardier would basically depress a button on the top of the joystick that he was using to fly the plane, but at the altitude they were dropping the bomb from, just even that little motion of the thumb would move the joystick enough that the bomb would be off target. So they had to move the button to his other hand so he could keep steady with the one to stay on target and drop the bomb with the other. So we go ahead and drop the bomb August 6, 1945, and then we turn around 3 days later and we drop another bomb on Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. And the devastation is phenomenal. At Hiroshima, we had 71,000 dead, 68,000 injured, and 4 square miles of the city are leveled. At Nagasaki, we had 36,000. We killed 36,000 people and injured an additional 60,000. And there's several reasons for that. One, there were 2 different bombs. There was the Fat Man and the Little Boy, and they're very different designs. Again, they were completely experimental, so we had no idea if either one of them would even work. They both did, amazingly enough, actually. Why the difference in death tolls? Well, some of that has to do with the nature of the cities themselves. Hiroshima was a traditional Japanese city. Most of the buildings were made out of timbers and rice paper walls. Well, it turns out rice paper doesn't exactly stand up well to atomic explosions, and so the city caught fire, buildings collapsed with the force of the blast wave, and that's why so much of the city was leveled. Nagasaki was different. It was a modern city. It was built with concrete and bricks and mortar, and so the buildings withstood the blast better and afforded a greater level of protection to the citizens. Not only that, in the case of Hiroshima, we had been dropping leaflets warning the people of Hiroshima to leave for it's called the LeMay letter, and saying that your city was slated for destruction. But the people got tired of it. Every day they'd see the bombers fly overhead, and every day they wouldn't drop bombs. And eventually they thought, well, this is ridiculous. They're obviously not talking about our city. So the people of Hiroshima started to stay. And so the morning of August 6th, when the air raid sirens go off and they hear the bombers overhead, they think nothing of it. Completely oblivious to the impending disaster that is getting ready to befall them. In Nagasaki, they had heard what had happened to Hiroshima. So when the air raid sirens go off, they get to the bomb shelters, they leave the city. They realize this is not just an idle threat. And so that's another reason for the difference in death tolls between the two cities. Nonetheless, again, absolutely devastating. But make no mistake about it, as deadly as that is, we killed even more people in Tokyo. The traditional bombing, had we had to go ahead and bomb those cities using traditional ordnance, the death toll would have been even higher. So, and to some way of thinking, the atomic bombs, for all of the horror, actually kill fewer people than a traditional bombing campaign or a traditional invasion of those two cities. But the point of using the atomic bomb wasn't to really level the cities. We were dropping those bombs for one person and for one person only, and we weren't wanting to kill him. We were wanting to change his mind. The audience for the atomic bombs was Hirohito. We knew that it would be better if he would decide to surrender, and we hoped that he would be so shocked by what he saw from the atomic bomb that this would jolt him into surrendering, which is something the Japanese absolutely were not open to doing. And it worked. Hirohito realizes he can't fight this, that to continue fighting against this is to sacrifice the lives of his people, who he definitely feels responsible for. And so Hirohito, against the advice of Hideki Tojo, the prime minister, and the army, in fact, the army and Tojo tried to put him under house arrest, so he couldn't surrender, but he issues the surrender, gets out on the radio, and it was a huge effect. The Japanese emperor, most people in Japan had never heard his voice. He didn't address the people, he didn't give speeches, and so when he makes a recording and it's broadcast over Japanese radio, for almost everyone in the country, it's the first time they've heard their emperor speak, and he's asking them to lay down their arms. And so the final surrender is actually issued on September 2nd, 1945, in Tokyo Bay on board the USS Missouri. The emperor himself does not show up to sign the treaty. He sends emissaries to do that, and for the United States it's similar. The guy who represents the U.S. is Douglas MacArthur, and he goes ahead and signs the surrender document on board a United States battleship, the Mighty Mo, in Tokyo Bay.